Wondrous Destiny. Chapter 14.
The following morning, just before sunrise, they set afoot to seek the other mystical stones, walking through Stardust Forest. Crimson and Orion, with his legion of valiant squirrel soldiers, Mrs. Layla and Mr. Napoleon. Crimson put on the mask and glanced 360 degrees around, locating the mystical stones. He saw several colors. A blue and a red one were the brightest of them all. The blue was northwest, inside the Mosquito Queen's castle, and the red one was directly north. Crimson chose the red one to avoid facing the Mosquito Guard soldiers, at least for now. He thought it best to do so after they acquired at least one more mystical stone, which would enable them with more powers. This way, he said. They began walking north. By noon, they reached the outskirts of the forest and decided to rest there. They ate some of the food they'd been carrying. Then, they continued walking towards the red light for the rest of the day, taking breaks occasionally. By sundown, they reached Rookfort Lake. Crimson put on the mask and saw a red mystical stone inside the lake underwater. "It's in there," Crimson exclaimed, pointing to the lake. "I'll get it," exclaimed Mr. Napoleon. "We're otters, after all. We're excellent swimmers." "Right," Crimson chuckled. Mr. Napoleon dove into the lake and slowly disappeared from sight. Everybody waited. Orion paced back and forth with his arms crossed in his chest, patrolling with his eyes any potential threats. Crimson did not remove his sight from the lake. There were pine trees surrounding it. The air was a bit dense and humid. 5 minutes passed by. Nothing. 10 minutes. Still no Mr. Napoleon in sight. Did he drown? Crimson asked with a worried voice. "Oh no, dear, no worries. Us otters can swim for longer than that," Mrs. Layla assured. "You can?" Crimson asked, surprised. "Oh yes, dear, no worries. He will not drown. We're expert swimmers. We thrive on water," she continued. "It's just like jogging to us." Just as Mrs. Layla explained to Crimson how well-adapted otters are to water, a splashing sound came from the lake. "It's too deep," gasped Mr. Napoleon, catching his breath. "I can't reach it." "What?" Crimson asked in disbelief. "You were swimming inside the lake for at least 5 minutes. How deep can it be?" "I don't think I even got to half the distance." "That's impossible," Crimson insisted. Mrs. Layla rushed towards her husband. There was murmuring amongst the rest of the crew. "We need to ask a seal to grab it for us," Napoleon said, with his hands on his knees, spitting water and catching his breath. Everyone glanced at him with eyes wide open and a straight face. He chuckled as he saw everyone's cluelessness. Mrs. Layla smiled and said for him, "You see, seals can hold their breaths for much longer than us otters." "Uh-huh," Mr. Napoleon affirmed. After a silent pause while everyone was digesting this new piece of information, Orion voiced a logical thought. "Why would a seal help us get a mystical stone?" "We give it something in return," Mrs. Layla answered. "Obviously." What could a seal want in return? An unexpected voice was heard coming from one of the soldiers of Orion's legion. Everyone turned to him, surprised. There was an awkward silence for a brief moment. "Everyone likes food," Crimson broke the silence. "Exactly," Mr. Napoleon agreed. "Let's hunt then," proposed Orion. "We will get to that, surely, but realistically speaking, it is easier to find food than to find a seal," replied Mr. Napoleon. "Huh, so where do we find one?" sighed Crimson, rolling his eyes. "Most of the ones we know dwell in Lake Paladin," Mr. Napoleon informed. "Don't you ever come out to the lakes?" Still catching his breath. "That's the lake where we came from." "Where I found you," cried Crimson. "Why didn't you think of that before we came all the way here?" he demanded. "How was I supposed to know that we would need a darn seal to grab a mystical stone?" he shot back. As they were continuing this back-and-forth discussion, they heard a branch break. It was rather loud. A branch breaking from a tree nearby, some 70 feet away. That was enough to silence the conversation. Everyone glanced in the direction of the sound with eyes wide open. Some of the soldiers from the Squirrel Legion immediately ran to check it out. After about a minute, they came back with a girl. "Look what we found, Orion," one of them said to their general. He brought a girl with a mushroom hat with her hands tied behind her back and forcibly stood her before everyone in the group. "A sprite," Layla gasped as she saw her. There was murmuring amongst the group. Everyone seemed to analyze her. Some even went up close, but nobody dared to touch her. Her wings, which were almost transparent, would move back and forth instinctively, almost like an involuntary muscle. Her face was pale, almost like snow, but she had purple and magenta outlines around it and through it. Her short skirt was light green and purple. Her eyes, which were also purple, but rather a lighter pigment of purple than her skirt, opened and closed violently as she struggled to break loose. The glitter coming from the pores of her skin would fly like shining dust, creating a sort of gold and light purple aura cloud around her. The purple mushroom hat she was wearing seemed somehow attached to her head. "Let me go," she exclaimed. Commander Orion paced back and forth in front of her. He remained silent, observant with a straight face and his hands on his chin. After a moment, he then spoke. "Your kind," he paused, "is not very common. To find one of you is more rare than to witness a shooting star in the skies. I will ask this once, and I do not want any lies. Wasting my time is not very wise," he continued. "Why did we find you?" "Let me go, and I'll answer," she replied. "She looks like Princess Molly," yelled Crimson. "Do you know her?" "Princess Molly is a sprite indeed too, young Crimson. That's part of why she is so special." "You really aren't from around here, are you?" asked Layla, raising her eyebrows and scratching her head. "You do not have anything to bargain with," said Orion. "I will only ask once more." "I will put your soldiers to sleep with my pollen," warned the sprite. "Do not test my patience," Orion began to say. "Oh, you boys have no proper manners," Layla interrupted. "That's no way to treat a lady." "Allow me. You boys obviously have no education." Layla approached her. By then, the soldiers were already falling to the ground due to the pollen the sprite had begun to release from her mushroom hat. "We are truly fortunate to come upon you, dear," Layla said softly. "To what do we owe the honor of your fortunate encounter?" The remaining soldiers holding her finally let go of her as Mrs. Layla began to take over the conversation. "I want to go seek the stones with you," the sprite replied in a soft voice, looking at the soldiers around, then down like a shy little girl. "You want to come with us?" Layla was surprised. "But you already possess many powers, sweet one. Why would you want to seek the mystical stones with us?" "You don't understand. Power is not why I wish to seek them with you. It's for the thrill of adventure. It's to be able to go on a quest with new friends," she exclaimed. "Being powerful sometimes means being lonely." Mrs. Layla could even relate to her. That's kind of the same reason she embarked on the adventure herself. On the other hand, Orion was not convinced to let her come. "We cannot allow you to come with us," Orion said firmly. "It will attract too much attention, and we want to be discreet about this mission." "I have a book," she began. "A book describing the abilities of each of the mystical stones." "What?" gasped Crimson. "Each color you see on your mask is a specific stone. The book I have also has the colors of each of the stones, and it describes the abilities of each in detail." "Have you been following us?" demanded Orion. "I have," she responded candidly. "Since when?" Orion was startled. "Since he came out of the portal," she replied, glancing at Crimson. Mr. Napoleon looked at Crimson with large eyes. "Which portal?" "The one that opened in front of Her Majesty's castle," responded the sprite, her eyes locked on Crimson. "Huh, I knew you weren't from around here," exclaimed Layla. "It's a long story," Crimson said, shielding his backstory. "We don't have time to waste." "He's right," affirmed Orion. "Although I don't know this Crimson, I trust Socrates' intuition about this young lad. We have to get going. Are you going to give us the book or not, Sprite Lady? We're not taking you with us anyhow, and if you don't give us the book, we can still search for them." "My name is Iconi," said the sprite, "and the book I speak of signals a stone that allows you to breathe underwater indefinitely. Or you can just guess which one it is or ask a seal to do it for you, I suppose." Everyone gasped. There was murmuring. Show it to me, demanded Orion. I buried it close to here. If you give me your word that I will join your quest, I will take you to the site where it is buried, she replied. You buried it? Asked Orion. In case you seized me, which you did, her eyes piercing Orion. Orion was silent, clenching his jaw and fists, thinking, You planned on being found. You planned this whole thing. Why now? Asked Orion. Who cares? What are we waiting for? Let's go get that book, exclaimed Crimson. Orion glanced at Crimson, then approached him. He grabbed him by the throat. The only reason I will allow this is because Socrates believed in you, Sir Crimson, he whispered up close in a threatening growl. He then took a deep breath and looked at the sprite. Take us to it, please, Lady Icones.